The mare's coat was black with sweat, and the hay smelled of the day it had been cut, sweet and a little burnt at the edges the way it always did in a dry August. And Mary Fenn set the last of the season's stems aside on the tailboard before her father could see her doing it. Because Tom Fenn had opinions about foolishness, and she did not want to hear them twice in one afternoon. The Ashcombe scales stood in the shade of the home farm's great open barn, black iron and old oak, worn smooth at the handle by 40 years of hands. And today there was a stranger standing at them, instead of the usual clerk with his ink-stained cuffs and his habit of shorting a farmer a stone if he thought no one was counting. This one wore a plain brown coat with no lace on it at all, and boots that had seen mud, and he counted the coin himself, aloud, into her father's palm. The way a man counts something he intends to be remembered counting. Tom Fenn's bad leg would not let him stand long at the scales any more, not since the mill accident had taken the strength out of it. So it was Mari who called the weight, Mari who watched the beam settle, Mari who did the sum in her head before the stranger's clerk had finished writing it in his book. Because hay had been the one language in her life that never once lied to her. She could tell a good cutting from a poor one with her eyes shut, by the way it gave under the hand, by the smell of it, sweet or sour, by the sound it made settling into a cart. Numbers she trusted the same way. So when the stranger paid out 11 shillings over the fair price of the load, she noticed it the way she noticed a wrongly stacked rick, at once, and with a small cold drop in her stomach that had nothing to do with the heat. She did not say so. Her father was proud in the particular way that poor men with old injuries are proud, and she had learned 4 years ago, at her mother's grave, that there were things a daughter kept to herself until she had somewhere safe to set them down. It was custom, when the last load of the year went over the scales, for whoever bought it to be given the last plat, the small figure of twisted hay her mother used to make from the finest stems set aside at the start of cutting. Bound at the waist with a thread of red wool, faceless, no bigger than a hand, kept by the hearth through the winter and turned into the first furrow in spring for luck. Mari had made this year's with her own fingers the night before, sitting up long after her father slept, because some things you did not let go simply because the person who taught them to you was gone. She held it out to the stranger without ceremony, the way her mother always had, and he took it as though he had been handed something considerably heavier than hay. He turned it over once in his hands. He asked what it was for, and she told him plainly that it kept the luck of the field until spring, and that a man who did not believe in luck should still be careful with it, the way he ought to be careful with anything that had been made by hand and given freely. He looked at her for a moment longer than the answer required. "Fine hay," he said, "the finest I have seen taken off Ashcombe ground in some years." "Hay doesn't lie," she said. "Only the men who weigh it do. If you think you've overpaid, say so before witnesses. Because I won't be accused later of having cheated a stranger out of his coin." Something moved behind his face when she said it, quick and hard to name, gone before she could read it properly. "I have not been cheated," he said. "Some debts are older than the hay that pays them." He touched 2 fingers to his hat and turned before she could ask what in the world that was supposed to mean. She thought about it the whole ride home, turning the coin purse over where it sat heavy against her hip, the sky going the colour of a fresh bruise behind them, the wind carrying the first cold smell of rain across the stubbled fields. Her father counted the money by the last of the daylight at the kitchen table, and went very still, the particular stillness she recognised from bad news. "It must be a mistake," he said. "No man pays 11 shillings over for hay unless he's drunk or paying off God. and either way it doesn't belong to the Fens. Not after everything. Not after your mother. We do not take charity from that house, he said, not ever again. And there was a whole buried history folded into the word again that Mari had learned long ago not to ask after directly. Old Nan Coggeshall was at the door within the hour, as she always seemed to be when there was trouble worth hearing about second-hand, and she took one look at the coin laid out on the table and said, deadpan, that if a duke's man paid double for hay he was either drunk or paying off God, which was very nearly what Tom had said, except Nan said it with considerably more relish, and finished by observing that either way the money ought to go back before it curdled in the house like milk left too near a thundercloud. The rain had already started against the shutters by the time Mari made up her mind, a low steady patter that would be a soaking by full dark, and her father told her she was a fool twice over, once for going, and once for going alone. And she told him that a fool who returned 11 honest shillings still slept easier than one who kept them, and she was saddling the mare in the yard before he could find a better argument than that. The rain came on hard before she had gone a mile, the kind of rain that turned the lane to a dark ribbon of moving water, and made the hedgerows loom up out of the dusk like the sides of a tunnel, and Mari rode with her chin down, and her hood plastered flat, and the coin-purse wrapped twice in oilcloth against her chest, as though it might otherwise dissolve. Ashcombe Hall came up grey and enormous out of the wet dark, more windows lit than any house had any right to need, and the gatehouse man told her plainly that decent women did not come calling after dark. "I have not come calling," she said. "I've come to return money that isn't mine. Either let me state my business, or explain to your master in the morning why 11 shillings of an honest tenant's coin spent the night rattling in a girl's saddle-bag because nobody at the gate had the sense to send word up the drive." Something in that argument, or perhaps only the shine of temper under the rain on her face, made him send a boy running. She waited under the gatehouse arch, dripping, furious at the cold, and more furious at herself for being cold, and when the door at the top of the drive opened it was not a footman who came down into the wet, but the man from the scales, coatless now, moving fast for someone dressed for indoors. He came close enough that the torchlight from the gatehouse caught him properly for the first time, and it was the boy who had run ahead who said it before she could stop him, out of breath, half a bow already started. "Your Grace." 2 words. The whole evening rearranged itself around them. She had handed her mother's plat and 11 shillings of fen pride into the hand of the Duke of Ashcombe, and had told him besides that hay did not lie, only the men who weighed it did, which was a fine thing to say to a stranger, and a considerably less fine thing to have said to the man who owned every acre for 6 miles, in any direction. He had the grace not to enjoy her discomfort openly, though something in the set of his mouth suggested it cost him. "I did wonder how long you would take to work that out," he said, and she told him she had worked it out the moment she saw his boots, because no duke's clerk wore boots that had actually stood in mud, and he laughed once, short and surprised, as though laughter itself were a habit he had let go slack from disuse. She held out the purse. He did not take it. She told him there had been a mistake at the scales, and she had come to correct it before he thought worse of the Fens than the truth deserved. "There was no mistake," he said quietly. "That sum was exactly what I intended to pay." When she asked why, plainly, the way she asked everything, he looked past her shoulder into the rain for a moment before answering. "A debt older than the hay," he said again, the same words as before, and this time she pressed him on it. "Because a woman who has ridden 2 miles through a storm to return honest money has earned the right to an honest answer. It concerns your family and mine," he said. "It goes back further than either of us, and I'm not yet certain enough of the shape of it to say more without doing someone an injustice." She noticed, without entirely meaning to, that his thumb had gone to the centre of his left palm, and was pressing there, hard, the way a man presses an old bruise to see if it still aches. She filed the gesture away, the same place she filed the smell of a hayrick gone sour before anyone else could smell it, which was to say she did not forget it. He would not take the money back. He offered instead to have her escorted home dry in the estate trap. "I rode out in the rain," she said, "and I'll ride home in it." The Fens don't accept what they haven't earned, in either direction. He asked then, almost as an afterthought, whether she wanted the Platt back, since by rights it seemed she had given it under false understanding of who she was giving it to. "No," she said. "Custom is custom, regardless of rank. You're as bound to keep it through the winter and turn it into your own ground come spring as any hay merchant in the county would have been. And if you break faith with a piece of twisted straw, I'll hear of it. Word travels." "I won't break faith with it," he said, and there was a stillness in the way he said it that did not match the smallness of the promise. She rode home through the last of the rain, turning that stillness over the same way she had turned the coin purse, unable to make the weight of it come out right. Michaelmas was 5 weeks off, and the word came to the Fen farm the way such words always came, folded inside a larger and more ordinary sentence, delivered by a boy from the estate office with mud on his boots and no particular malice in his face, only the flat unhappiness of someone paid to carry bad news to people he liked. There was an arrears entered against the Fen tenancy, a levy for improvements to the Ford Road some years back that had never, it seemed, been properly settled, and it stood now at a sum that made Tom Fen go the colour of old tallow when he heard it read aloud. Mari asked to see the figures. The boy did not have them. Mr. Grieve had them, at the estate office, and Mr. Grieve would be glad to explain the accounting to anyone who cared to walk up and ask, though it was said in a tone that suggested very few people who walked up ever came away glad of anything. She went up anyway, on the quarter day, when the tenants gathered in the long hall to settle their accounts before witnesses, an old custom the Duke himself rarely troubled to attend. Silas Grieve had a way of smiling that arrived promptly, the way a shop door opens on a bell, ready for business whether or not there was any joy behind it, and he smiled that way at Mari across his own table while he laid out the figures for the Ford levy. Patient, precise, entirely reasonable on the page, and entirely wrong in some way she could not yet name. Fair women, he told her, make poor bookkeepers. They wish the sums to be kinder than sums generally are. Fair women make excellent bookkeepers, she said, because they don't mind an unkind sum so long as it's an honest one. Yours is neither. He did not answer that directly. He mentioned instead, with the same unhurried courtesy, that word travelled fast in a small county, and that a farmer's daughter riding to a duke's door after dark was the kind of word that travelled fastest of all, and it would be a pity, would it not, if that word reached certain ears before the Fen arrears were quietly settled. The Dowager Duchess Constance was present that day, seated apart from the tenant business, with the particular stillness of a woman who missed nothing while appearing to attend to none of it, and she looked once at Mari across the hall, a long, unhurried, assessing look. "I understand the hay girl rode to the hall at midnight," she said to the lady beside her, not troubling to lower her voice, which is either great impertinence or great desperation, and I have not yet decided which is worse in a tenant's daughter. Lady Elena Vance sat beside the dowager that afternoon, newly arrived from her father's house for the autumn, lovely and composed, and clearly uncomfortable at being discussed as a fixed and settled matter in a room full of other people's business, and she offered Mari the smallest private nod on her way out, the kind one gives a person one suspects one has been unfairly set against. Tom Fenn said nothing throughout the whole of it, his hat in his 2 hands, his bad leg trembling faintly from standing too long, and it was only that night, at the kitchen table, with the arrears figure written out plain in front of them both, that he told her the thing she had never once been able to get out of him before. Your mother could not close her left hand from the day she was 19 years old till the day she died, he said, and never once complained of it. Not to me, not to the physician, not to God as far as I ever heard. I used to watch her work the dough with that hand curled half shut like a bird's foot and think, there is a woman who has already paid more than anybody ought to be asked to pay, and asked for nothing back. She asked what had happened to it. He looked at the fire for a long while before he answered. It happened at the Wrenford, he said, long before you were born. It's not my story to finish telling. But I've always thought somebody at the Hall owed a debt on account of it that was never once paid. It was Julian himself who sent for her the following week. Not through Greaves' office, but by his own hand. A plain note, asking whether she would walk the home meadow with him to look over the boundary hedge before the levy assessors came through, which both of them understood to be only partly about the hedge. They walked the long field in a thin autumn light, with the wren running low and brown along its edge, and for a while neither of them spoke of anything but the hedge, which needed laying, and the ditch, which needed clearing, ordinary talk between 2 people who both knew the ground under their feet better than most people knew their own hands. Then he told her, without her asking directly this time, what he could remember of the day at the ford. He had been 7 years old, he said, and had gone down to the water against every instruction he had ever been given, because the wren, after heavy rain, looked like something worth disobeying instructions for, and the current had taken him before he understood what was happening. And the last clear thing he remembered before the cold closed over his head was a hand closing on his wrist, small and strong and burning hot against the freezing water, and being hauled up the bank by a girl no older than 16, who had gone into the mill race after him, without once stopping to consider whether it was sensible. He did not know her name until years later, and by then his father, who had sworn on the bank that day that the Fenn family would never want for anything again as long as there was an Ashcombe to give it to them, was already an old man too proud and too private to speak of debts of that size in front of his own steward, and the promise, whatever shape it had taken, seemed to have gone into the ground with him 8 years ago, unfulfilled and unmentioned. I found a fragment of it, Julian said, going still the way a man goes still over something he has decided at last to say plainly, in his private correspondence not 2 years back. A torn half of a letter that spoke of the meadow and of gratitude, and of a girl's name I did not at first recognise. I have been trying since to work out what my father meant to do, and never did, and paying what small restitution I dared, without understanding enough yet to do more than that. Mari said her mother's name for him, quietly, and watched something in his face come loose that had plainly been held tight for a long time. That was her, he said. That was Alice Fenn. He did not finish the sentence the way she expected, with grief or apology. Instead, his hand went to his palm again, that same unconscious pressing, and this time she asked him outright what the mark was, and he showed her a thin pale seam across the centre of his hand where the mooring rope had run through his grip that day and taken the skin with it. "I have never told anyone what it was from," he said. It seemed a small thing to carry beside what it cost her. It was not a small thing, she said, more heat in it than she meant to show. A debt doesn't become small merely because the man who owed it found it easier to be quiet about. He was still working out how to answer that when a groom came pounding across the field with word that Mr. Grieve required Miss Fenn's presence at the estate office directly, on account of the arrears, on account of the Michaelmas deadline now standing at 4 weeks and counting. Grieve's offer, laid out on his own table an hour later, was reasonable on its surface the way all of Grieve's offers were reasonable on their surface. The arrears would be struck entirely from the Fenn account, the whole sum forgiven, if Mari would sign a fresh lease acknowledging the family's tenancy under the standard terms, with a clause besides disavowing, on the Fenn family's behalf, any claim, rumour, or expectation touching the meadow's ownership beyond that tenancy, now or in future. She thought of her father's trembling hat, of the 4 weeks standing between them and ruin, and she signed it, because a debt her father could not survive was not a debt she was willing to gamble against a fragment of a torn letter and an old scar on a duke's palm, whatever her heart told her the scar meant. It was Nan who found the second fragment, in the end, though it was Mari's own habit of doing sums twice that made sense of it. Nan had come to help turn out Alice's old workbox, the one nobody had opened since the funeral, on the pretext of finding buttons, and beneath the spools and the folded patterns there was a scrap of paper in a hand that was not Alice's, torn ragged along one edge, bearing the words meadow, ingratitude, so long as, and beneath that a name Mari did not recognise written small in the margin, and beneath that again the broken corner of a wax seal she did recognise, because she had seen its twin pressed into the corner of every serious document that had ever come down from Ashcombe Hall. She had laid the Fenn rent receipts out on the table beside it that same night, every one her mother and then her father had ever kept, going back further than either of them could properly remember why, and added the sums twice, the way she added any figure she meant to trust, and found that not one of them matched any published rent rate the estate had ever set for a meadow of that size. Not by a little, but by a margin too consistent to be accident and too strange to be honest error. She rode out at first light to find Simeon Locke, who had kept the estate's scales and its weighing books for longer than Grieve had kept its ledgers, and who remembered things the way old men remember the weather of particular years, exactly and without being asked twice. He looked at the fragment a long while before he spoke. A stack cut wet and stored careless will rot from the inside where nobody can see it, he told her. And you will not know it has gone until the whole rick comes down some February morning, with no warning at all. A debt left unpaid is no different. It doesn't vanish for being buried. It only rots where nobody's looking, until the roof falls in on somebody who never did the burying. There was talk once, he admitted, when he was younger than Mari was now, that the Ford meadow was not rented at all but given, though nobody who repeated it ever repeated it twice in Grieve's hearing, and he told her, if she wanted the truth of it rather than the talk of it, she ought to look to the house and not the office, because a steward's ledger told you what a steward wanted told, but a family kept its real secrets closer to the hearth. She rode home that evening with the fragment folded inside her glove, and her mind already turning toward the Hall's own library, toward whatever the old Duke might have left behind him, that a busy steward, 30 years settled into his own convenience, had never troubled to look for. The library at Ashcombe smelled of beeswax and old paper, and faintly, of the river that ran past the lower windows, and Julian himself pulled down box after box of his father's private correspondence, while Mari read beside him with the particular patience she brought to any long reckoning. Until past midnight on the second evening they found it folded inside the back board of an old estate. Ledger where no one had thought to look, because no one had thought a man like the old Duke would hide anything so important somewhere so ordinary. It was water-stained along one edge, and the ink had faded to brown, but the hand was clear enough, and the seal, whole this time, matched the broken fragment exactly. It set out, in the old Duke's own careful sentences, that the meadow bordering the Wrenford was given, freely and in full, to the family of the girl who had pulled his son from the mill race at the cost of her own hand, to hold and to pass down as their own, not as tenants but as owners, and that he intended to see it properly registered before the county the following spring. He had died that winter, before spring came. Grieve, they understood without needing it written anywhere, had found the paper among the estate's affairs not long after, recognised that an unregistered gift had no force in any court, and had simply gone on collecting rent on land that had ceased, in every way that mattered, to belong to the estate at all. They sat with it a long while in the lamplight, Julian's hand near enough to hers on the table that she could feel the warmth of it without either of them closing the distance, and it was in that stillness, with neither of them speaking, that the library door opened and Eleanor Vance stood in it, and behind her a moment later Silas Grieve, drawn by a servant's careless word that the Duke was closeted alone with the Hay girl over some old paper of his father's. Eleanor's face did the arithmetic of the scene before either of them could explain it, wrongly, and went carefully blank in the particular way of a woman deciding not to make a scene in front of a servant. Grieve's face did no such courtesy. He crossed the room fast enough that his usual smile had not caught up with the rest of him, and when he saw what lay open on the table between them, something in him went very still and very cold. "That paper proves nothing in any court," he said, and his voice had none of its usual patience left in it. An old man's unregistered kindness, scratched out on a page nobody witnessed, and I have 30 years of settled ledgers standing against one water-stained sheet. I will burn down every good name in this house before I let a Hay girl and a besotted boy undo 30 years of careful work over a debt that was never anyone's to collect but mine to manage. He did not touch the paper. He looked at it the way a man looks at a fire he has just realised he cannot put out. And then he turned and left the room without another word, and it was only afterward, once the door had closed, that Mari understood the true shape of the danger, because a man who has just been caught rarely leaves quietly, unless he already knows exactly what he intends to do next. He did exactly what he had promised, in his own unhurried fashion, over the days that followed. Word went round the village that the Hay girl had been seen closeted alone with the Duke past midnight, and word travels faster and less kindly than truth ever does, and by the end of the week Tom Fenn's other small debts, the ordinary ones every farmer carried, had all been quietly called in at once, in a manner no honest steward would have troubled with unless he meant it as a lesson. Constance summoned Mari to the hall herself, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular weariness of a woman trying to prevent a fire from becoming a conflagration, and laid out the sensible course plainly, the Fenn arrears forgiven in full, a generous sum settled on the family besides, on the single condition that the old paper be returned to the family archive and never spoken of again. "It is not unkindness I am offering you," the Dowager said. "It is mercy, and mercy costs less than truth in every case I have ever seen. "My mother lived 19 years with a hand that would not close," Mari said, "and was never once offered mercy of that shape. Only silence. I won't be paid to keep that same silence a second time on her behalf. You cannot bury a debt deeper and call it settled. You can only bury it deeper." Simeon, when she told him what had passed, only nodded slowly, and said that a woman who wanted a paper to hold up in daylight had best find someone still living who remembered the day it was written, and that the old Duke's chaplain, retired these 10 years to a cottage past cradle end, might yet remember more than he had ever thought worth telling. It was Julian, in the end, who took the decision furthest out of her hands, and did it, she understood even as it was happening, entirely out of a wish to protect her. He came to the farm himself, and told her, standing in the yard with his hat in his hand like any ordinary caller, that he had settled the Fen debts privately from his own purse, all of them, and that he thought it best, given Grieve's threats, and given the talk already spreading, that she stay away from the hall until matters had quieted, for her own safety and her own name. She heard, under the careful courtesy of it, the exact shape of the thing her mother had lived and died inside, a decision made for a woman by a man who believed himself to be protecting her. "I will not be managed the way my mother was managed," she told him, silently, and for my own good, by anyone, however kindly meant. He did not have an answer that satisfied either of them. She refused his money as she had refused it before, and rode home. And that evening she stood a long while at the hearth with her mother's spare thread, and the memory of the plait still out there somewhere in a stranger's keeping, wondering whether the whole of it, the paper, the promise, the Ford, the hand that would not close, had ever been worth chasing at all, or whether some debts were simply meant to rot quietly in the dark, the way Simeon had said they would, whether anyone went looking for them or not. She did not burn anything. It was not in her in the end to destroy the one thing her mother had made with her own 2 ruined hands, and somewhere past midnight, sitting with the thread still in her lap, she understood that the only way through was the way she had always trusted best, plainly and in the open, in front of witnesses, the way you settled a weight on the scales rather than argued about it after dark. She rode to the old chaplain's cottage past Cradle End the next morning, and found him willing enough to remember, once he understood what was at stake, and willing besides to set his memory down in his own hand and sign it, because he had watched the old Duke weep over that unregistered promise more than once in his last winter, and had always thought it a shame it went with him unfulfilled. Michaelmas came in on a morning scrubbed clean by the night's rain. The sky rinsed to a hard pale blue, and the long hall at Ashcombe filled with tenants the way it always did on quarter day. Grieve at the head table with his ledgers stacked before him like fortifications, reading out the Fen arrears as settled and closed, a small formality before the more pressing business of the day. Mari walked the length of that hall, in front of every tenant on the estate, with the old Duke's letter in one hand and the chaplain's signed memory in the other, and asked, in a voice that did not shake though her hands nearly did, that both be read aloud, so that everyone present might hear the same words at the same moment and judge them for themselves. It was Simeon who read the old Duke's letter, his voice steady, with the particular gravity of a man who had waited 30 years to say something true in that room. And the hall went silent around the sound of it, every tenant leaning in the way people lean toward a fire on a cold night. Constance rose from her seat before he had finished, and touched the seal herself, and went very still. "I once asked my husband what had become of the Ford Meadows deed," she told the room, the words costing her visibly, and he told me only that it was being seen to, and I did not think to ask him twice. That failure is as much mine as any man's in this hall." Elena stood then, unbidden, and produced a letter of her own, found among her father's papers, in which Silas Grieve had proposed, some years back, a quiet arrangement over the handling of certain irregular Ashcombe tenancies in exchange for a share of the profit on their eventual sale, and she read it aloud herself. "I release the Duke from any understanding between our families," she finished, with a small dry smile that cost her nothing at all, "since it has been plain to me for some months that his heart has already settled its accounts elsewhere. I wish him joy of it." Grieve lunged for the old Duke's letter across the table before anyone quite understood he meant to, his hand closing hard on the paper, and it was Tom Fenn of all people, bad leg and all, who caught his wrist and held it there in front of the whole assembled hall until Simeon had pried the letter free undamaged. Grieve stood shaking afterward, stripped in a moment of 30 years of careful patience. "I built my whole name out of paper and patience," he said, in a voice gone suddenly old, "out of nothing. After burying a wife and a son the estate's own physician could not save, and I will not apologise for guarding what little I made for myself, whatever it cost the Fenns to make it." He was escorted out with what dignity was left to him, his stewardship ended, his pension left intact out of a mercy Mari herself asked be shown him, and the hall emptied slowly around the old letter, lying open on the table in the last low light of the afternoon, until only Julian and Mari were left standing at either end of it. He came round the table first. "I sent you away to keep you safe," he said, "and I understand now that it was the same thing done to your mother, decided for her, and never asked of her. I am sorry for it, more sorry than I have words arranged for yet." She told him she forgave him, because she did, but that forgiveness was not the same as agreement, and if there was to be any of what he seemed to want between them, she would have her conditions stated plainly and not softened for either of their comfort. She wanted the meadow registered properly this time, in her father's name and her own, in the county record, beyond any steward's reach forever. She wanted to go on doing the weighing herself, every season, title or no title, because it was the one thing in her life that had never once lied to her, and she did not intend to give it up for a duchess's idle hands. She wanted Grieve's old office given to someone who answered to the tenants as much as to the house, and she named Simeon for it before Julian could suggest anyone else. And she wanted the overpaying, if he meant to go on doing it, done in the open from now on, not as a secret debt paid in shame, but as a kindness anyone could see and understand for what it was. He agreed to every one of them, without trying to talk her down from a single one, which she took, rightly, as a better sign than any speech he could have made her. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the little church past Cradle End, with Nan weeping loudly enough for 3 mourners, and Simeon standing witness in his good coat. And a year on from that, Michaelmas the hay came in dry and sweet again, and Mari stood at the old iron scales in the shade of the barn, with her sleeves rolled same as always, calling the weight for a young tenant family new to the estate, and clearly frightened of owing anyone anything at all. And she paid them, in full view of everyone present, considerably more than the load was worth, on purpose, because some debts were best paid forward rather than back. Julian stood beside her with hay dust on his good coat, and a length of the finest stems set aside from the cutting, working them slowly and badly into the shape his wife had shown him twice already that morning. And when the young tenant's daughter asked what in the world he was making, he told her, with the particular seriousness of a man repeating something he had learned the hard way, that hay did not lie, only the men who weighed it did, and that this was the one true thing he knew, and he meant to go on proving it for the rest of his life. Mari did not look up from the scale, but she reached over without looking and took the hand with the old thin scar across the palm, and held it, in front of everyone, because there was nothing left in either of their lives that needed hiding anymore. If this one kept you a while tonight, warm and unhurried the way a story ought to be, stay by the fire a little longer before you go. I think of Mari most, riding back through that first rain with money she would not keep, and of the old Duke's letter finally read aloud after 30 years of silence, and I'd love to know which moment held you tightest, so tell me in the comments below, and while you're there, settle in with Dr. H channel _ name each. Subscribe if you'd like another chair pulled up to this hearth, because there is always another story waiting on the fire to be told. Sleep well tonight, and be kind to whoever is counting on you tomorrow.